this morning, the one we're about to do, the others that I will do today, tomorrow, and in the coming week. I try to put you on the ground and talk as specifically as I can about what happened, where we then are. What we are going to do in this program is we will leave here in a couple of minutes, and we will we'll work our way west-southwestward along Brotherton Road. And then we are going to turn south, go down a trail. We will then work our way into Brock Field. We're going to primarily focus on the engagement of one Confederate infantry brigade, Preston Smith's brigade, Benjamin Franklin Cheatham's division, in the action in the early afternoon of September the 19th, 1863. Along the way, we are going to walk on some paved surfaces, some grassy surfaces, some trails, a short distance through the woods, and then in a grassy field. At all points, be cognizant of your footing. Watch where you're stepping. Even on the trails, the surface varies in quality with roots and stumps and limbs and the like. So just be careful of your footing. We don't need any more casualties here at Chickamauga, we'll make our way along this path and back here. The total route is a little under a mile and a half. Along with us today is one of the National Military Park's fine volunteers, Robert Carter. Robert is along to help out, to be here to help answer questions as needed, but also to if you decide that you do need to come back before the program is over and you're not quite certain what route to take, Robert can help direct you back here to our starting point. We are now looking at action in the early afternoon of September the 19th. The Battle of Chickamauga, as it is becoming, and of course it is the fighting on the 19th and 20th, which gets the most focus in the studies of the battle. They certainly are the two heaviest days of conflict, but the battle that is now unfolding on September the 19th at midday is a very different battle than the one that Confederate Army Commander Braxton Bragg had envisioned when he developed his plan and went to execute it by sending his troops forward finally on the afternoon of September the 17th, and then hoping to bring on his battle by midday on September the 18th. Now, at midday on September the 19th, a very different Battle of Chickamauga is unfolding. Bragg's Battle of Chickamauga would have begun at Lee and Gordon's Mill. From here, 2.5 or so miles to the southwest of us, and gone southwest from that point. But now, because of Union Army Commanders William Stark Rosecrans' anticipation that Bragg may indeed try to get between him and Chattanooga, and his ability to have marched troops, as he had done on the night of the 18th in the early morning hours of the 19th, extended the Union left flank further north to the area of the Kelly Field, and George Thomas's subsequent movement on the morning of the 19th. What we know of as the Battle of Chickamauga is unfolding. Having begun near Jay's Mill at or just after dawn in many ways, and then intensified when George Thomas sent John Brannan's division out to capture a lone Confederate brigade, and now it has flowed south to this area or by late morning and early afternoon. We want to look at the experience in particular of one Confederate brigade of the next Confederate division to go into action in the battle. Any questions or observations at this point before we set off? All righty. We don't have far to go for our first stand. The corridor of Alexander Bridge Road, you're looking northwestward. This road on my map here is right here. In about a mile's distance, it will take you out to the Lafayette Road. About a mile and a half's distance, you'll cross West Chickamauga Creek at Alexander's Bridge. And I point this road out primarily to use as kind of a general initial guide to understand the axis of this next action that we're going to be talking about. The Confederate division that we are focusing on is Benjamin Franklin Cheatham's division of Leonidas Polk's Corps. Benjamin Franklin Cheatham is the son of a prominent Middle Tennessee family that by marriage has connections back to the earliest days of European settlement in Middle Tennessee, the Donaldsons and the Robertsons. Cheatham had won some notoriety fighting with Tennessee soldiers in the Mexican War, and at the beginning of the Civil War, he quickly becomes a general in first the state of Tennessee Army, the Army of Tennessee, the state's army, not to be confused with this Confederate Army. But then, as the state of Tennessee forces are transferred to the Confederate States of America, once Tennessee joined the Confederacy in the summer of 1861, Cheatham becomes a brigadier general and soon thereafter a major general in the new Confederate Army. And he rose relatively quickly to division command, despite having relatively little military training and experience. But he is known as a hard fighter and also a hard drinker. And he liked some of the products of some of the commercial establishments in Middle Tennessee, and so much so that 9 months before this battle, in the Battle of Murfreesboro, he was a little too fortified and had problems sitting his horse on the 31st day of December, 1862. He is recognized for his hard fighting, not always committing his troops in the most effective fashion, but recognized hard fighter. But he also is recognized as one of the men in the anti-Bragg circle within the Army. His division, along with the other in Leonidas Polk's Corps, had been assigned on September the 18th to demonstrate in front of the Federals at Lee and Gordon's Mill on West Chickamauga Creek. Polk's Corps, along with Hill's Corps, was to fix the Union Army in place along West Chickamauga Creek from Lee and Gordon's Mill southwestward, while Confederate soldiers under Simon Bolivar Buckner, William Henry Talbot Shot Pouch Walker, Bushrod Russ Johnson, and John Bell Hood, and Nathan Bedford Forrest crossed West Chickamauga Creek downstream to then begin the attack against the Union left flank, which was then at Lee and Gordon's Mill. And if that attack had happened as Bragg wanted it, then Leonidas Polk's troops, including Polk's Corps, would have crossed the creek at Lee and Gordon's Mill, or, as is actually going to be the case, they were held ready to potentially cross the creek at the nearest viable crossing of the creek downstream of Lee and Gordon's Mill, Dalton's, or Hunt's Ford to join the main Confederate attacking force. And as Bragg, having failed to anticipate that the Union Army might react and shift troops further north overnight, Braxton Bragg, on the morning of the 19th, is massing troops in this area to resume the movement of the day before against a Union left flank that he thought would still be at Lee and Gordon's Mill, but which in actuality is now 3 miles further to the north. And Cheatham's division, early on the morning of the 19th, will ford West Chickamauga Creek at Dalton's Ford. Some units are allowed the time to take their shoes, socks, pants, and if they've got long drawers on, long drawers off to cross the creek. It was cold enough to frost the night before. Those men were desirous of having dry, warm clothes to put on once they were across the creek. But some men, because of the urgency of the circumstances, some units are told to cross the creek without undressing. And they wade at West Chickamauga Creek, depending upon the height of the soldier, anywhere there at the ford from knee to waist in depth. Cheatham's division, in fact, Preston Smith's brigade that we're going to be talking about is going to cross second. They then will be massed down here preparatory for that resumption of the Confederate assault against the Union left flank. But of course that never happens because the Union left flank is no longer down here, but is up here, and in action that we've talked about this morning, George Thomas sends Brannan's division out, then Baird's division out, and we have the battle that is now flowing into this area. And as it became increasingly clear in late morning to Braxton Bragg that a significant body of federal troops is further north than he had both hoped, planned, and intended, Braxton Bragg is sending increasing numbers of troops to the north, and in late morning, Benjamin Franklin Cheatham is given the order to march his division north to support the troops of Walker and Forrest, who were then engaged in the battle, the action going here. And they come marching up. They'll march about a mile's distance, and they come in to the rear of Walker's area, just as Liddell's division is being driven back by Cruxton's brigade. There are Confederates who are retreating towards these advancing men of Cheatham's division, and they think they are coming literally into the rear of Walker's command. But Walker has been pushed off to the east, not south. And so when Cheatham deploys his division, he does not deploy exactly on the same footprint of Walker. And on this map, both Walker and Liddell are Walker. He does not deploy to fight on that same footprint. He winds up deploying to the southwest of where Walker had been engaged. And that is going to result then in this line that we're going to be seeing and talking about. Cheatham has a large division, about 6,500 men. He has 5 brigades, and he deploys 3 brigades across the front. John K. Jackson's Georgia and Mississippi Brigade on the right, Preston Smith's Tennessee Brigade in the center, and Marcus Wright's Tennessee Brigade on the left. George Maney's and Otto Strahl's Tennessee Brigades are in a second line in support. And about noon, Cheatham will send John K. Jackson, Preston Smith, and Marcus Wright forward towards the Federals. Jackson's right is astride this Alexander Bridge Road, and Jackson will essentially guide on this road as he moves northward towards the Federals, who were then forcing Walker back. And so Jackson is going to be moving some of his men right through the area where we stand, but the majority of Jackson's line off to the left. And some of you all who were here last year will remember that one of the anniversary programs we did last year looked at the fight of Jackson and Maney on the line here. But what we're going to do now is we're going to kind of walk across the front of Jackson's brigade, and then later when Jackson is replaced, Maney's brigade, we're going to kind of walk across the front of that brigade, and we're going to go on down the developing line towards the area where Preston Smith is positioned. Any questions or observations here? All right. Walk past the Maney's Brigade tablet there and the Jackson Brigade tablet. If you look at them and they're facing, they kind of reflect that, or they do reflect that movement of Jackson's and then later Maney's men across this ground in that direction, kind of moving up the corridor of the Alexander Bridge Road. To Jackson's left is going to be Preston Smith's brigade, and you can see the Brock field there. And in general, this line of Cheatham's division is going to extend off in that southwestern direction. And so just kind of remember the orientation of those two tablets and that axis of Alexander Bridge Road, because we're going to, over the next few minutes, walk out of sight of that, and we'll have fewer landmarks to keep in mind to help keep our orientation. I'll try to keep you pointed in the right direction, but there won't be as many things to just quickly look at to orient on. So. You notice to your left there's a trail that goes south. Just before it reaches the road, it bends. A couple of you all have been along on a number of my programs over the years, so I might have quizzed you on this already. But anybody know where it is we roughly stand right now? The edge of Brock Field. Where's Brock Field? It's down there. But Brock Field should really extend all the way to about here where we are. Let's go forward just a short distance further. That we are viewing from modern Brotherton Road was in Brock Field. This drainage runs some kind of north and south, but it was actually out in the field at the time. And so the field needs to extend almost up to where those vehicles are parked behind us. In general, on the battlefield park today, where there are fields, there were fields at the time. And where there was forest at the time. But the size of some of the fields today is, there are a few that are a little too large, but there are quite a few that are a little too small, and that's the case with Brockfield. With this part, I'll talk more about historic Brockfield in a few minutes as well. So a much bigger field, and so part of what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be in the woods. which would actually have been in the field at the time. So, all right. So we actually have to go back a short distance so we can get on that trail. A few years ago for another program I did, I spent a lot of time looking for the one in the southwestern corner, thinking that that appears to have been in woods for such a long time that maybe it would be out there, but I could not find it. I took the time to take some measurements from some of the drainages and the like to try to figure out, roughly where it would be, and came out and tried to pace that off. I haven't been able to find any of them. We now are kind of standing on what would have been the edge of Rock Field. You can still see Brotherton Road right there. But you would have been looking out into the field at the time. Also, on the north side of the road, there was an area of felled timber. Why might there be felled timber? Before any battle. Well, the Brock family apparently had either directly themselves or by arrangements with someone was allowing timbering or logging to occur on their property. Maybe with the idea of expanding their field. The soldier descriptions from both sides from the 19th of September are of felled trees, felled timber, treetops, stacks of wood, logs. Well, what's just a mile down Brotherton Road in that direction? Jay's Mill. And the saw logs were probably being taken down to Jay's Mill to be sawn into lumber. Jay's Mill is only 7 miles away from the Western Atlantic Railroad. And A. William J., we don't know for certain that it's the exact same J of this Jay's Mill, is recorded as having sold plank timber to lumber to the Western Atlantic Railroad. But there is felled timber in the woods on the other side, and that'll come into play in the story a little bit later on. But let's go on down the line here just a short distance. The front of Jackson's brigade in doing this, and we've now entered the area of Preston Smith's brigade. They have come up behind you there. These are all Tennesseans. This brigade is of men from literally across the volunteer state. There are West Tennesseans in the brigade, but there are also Middle Tennesseans, and there are even East Tennesseans, East Tennessee Confederates in this brigade. Some of these regiments are the earliest in service for the Confederate state of Tennessee, And in fact, one of the regiments actually predates the war. And it also is one of the most unique of Tennessee's Civil War regiments. It is the 154th Tennessee. Now, a lot of people see that and they say, did Tennessee raise 154 or more regiments? No. This regiment goes back to the Tennessee militia. Even before there was a Tennessee, when Tennessee was North Carolina, there was a militia, a citizen military force that could be called out in time of need. In fact, much of the military force that the colonies mobilized to win independence from the British Crown were the militias of those colonies. And this tradition of citizen soldiers is long standing in the United States, and this would in many ways be essentially the National Guard today, although there is today a much stronger tie between the National Guards of each of the states and the federal government than there was with the militia at the time of the Civil War. But when Tennessee adopted a new constitution in 1836, they had also revised their militia law. And they had divided the state into 4 militia districts, 1 for all of East Tennessee, 2 in Middle Tennessee, splitting the state north and south, and 1 for West Tennessee. And if you think about Tennessee in 1836, there wasn't much west of the Tennessee River to the Mississippi River at the time. And then within those divisions, and it was the divisions were the lines splitting them were county lines. Within the divisions were brigades, where several counties were together, and then within counties there were individual regiments. And most counties had more than 1 regiment. And all of those regiments were numbered from 1 in East Tennessee westward across the state as it was in the late 1830s and the early 1840s. But as the population grew, there was the provision for providing more regiments, and Shelby County received the designation for another militia regiment, the 154th. And once the sectional crisis became really heated in the late 1850s, after John Brown's raid on the Harper's Ferry Armory in West Virginia, there was a revival of the militia tradition in the state, and the creation of more volunteer companies within each county. And a number of those volunteer companies from Memphis decided that they wanted a more permanent organization, and they got the state of Tennessee to charter the 154th Regiment Tennessee Militia as a corporation in the state of Tennessee. This is before secession. And so when Tennessee secedes, there is already this one organization that is essentially a corporate level organization. And it continues into Confederate service, and to the very end of the war, there is a 154th Tennessee Infantry. It's one of the earliest regiments in Tennessee in the Civil War. But being an early war regiment, you can imagine that that also brings them to see some of the earliest action, including at Belmont in November of 1861, and then of course Shiloh in April of 1862. They have lost strength as a result, and also being volunteer companies from a prestigious place like Memphis, many men had found other assignments, been promoted to be officers in other regiments, or were staff assignments. The 154th was very small. The 13th Tennessee similarly was very small. The 12th Tennessee was very small. And there were similar problems with other regiments in Bragg's army, and in the spring of 1863, Bragg consolidated some of these regiments. But rather than break them up entirely because of state pride, he simply paired them together. And so the 13th and 154th have been paired together as a single regiment on the battlefield. And the 154th's 11 companies now form 5 of the 10 companies in the consolidated 13th and 154th Tennessee. Similarly, in the 12th and 47th Tennessee, this has occurred as well. And there are a number of units across the Army of Tennessee where they have been consolidated. If a unit was successful in getting its numbers back above 400, they could unconsolidate. And in fact, if you look at Govan's Arkansas Brigade, there are changes in the consolidation between June and September of 1863 as some regiments regained enough strength to become disassociated with the one that they had been paired with. This adds a whole level of complexity to understanding Bragg's Confederate Army of Tennessee, because what do you do with those excess officers? They are assigned to different duties at one time or another. But Maney's brigade is just over 1,600 men strong here at Chickamauga, and consists of 6 Tennessee regiments, the 11th, 12th, and 47th, 13th, and 154th, and 29th, and a Tennessee battery of artillery, Scott's battery, whose position we stand at right now. The Preston Smith is a prominent attorney from Memphis, and has been the longtime brigade commander, and he is now leading his brigade forward on the battlefield. Just 10 days ago, within the brigade, they have created a battalion of sharpshooters, recognizing the importance of having efficient skirmishers. They have created a skirmish battalion or sharpshooter battalion within the brigade. And as Major Green will write, on the morning of September 9, by order of Brigadier General Preston Smith, 2 companies from the 11th Tennessee were detached from my command and ordered to report to Major Dawson of the 154th Senior Tennessee Regiment, with 3 other companies, 2 from the 12th and 47th regiments consolidated, and 1 from the 154th Tennessee Regiment, all of Smith's brigade, and formed a battalion of sharpshooters numbering 252 rifles, which was placed under the command of Major Dawson and myself. Now, in other brigades within Bragg's army, these battalions of sharpshooters or skirmishers had been in play or in existence for a longer time period. Being Tennesseans, they were very much of a mind to want to attack and drive the Federals back and out of Tennessee, and so they particularly took to heart the words of Braxton Bragg in a general order issued on September the 16th. We are fortunate that for this brigade we have a diary of an officer in the 12th Tennessee. This diary covers almost the entirety of the war. It basically does cover the entire war. However, the author of the diary, Alfred T. Fielder, a captain in the 12th Tennessee, there are a couple of periods when he is not with the regiment. He's wounded at Missionary Ridge and is away for some time, so it doesn't give us insight into the regiment during the time that he is absent recovering, and there are a couple of other short periods like that as well. We do have the Fielder's views for Chickamauga, and Fielder is an interesting fellow for a Civil War soldier. At the beginning of the war, when he volunteered in the state of Tennessee, Army of Tennessee, he was 47 years old. And what did I say is remarkable about the diary? It covers the entire war. He is 51 by the time the war ends in 1865. And except for being absent for a couple of short periods, he is with this regiment as a company officer, which means that he gets from place to place on what? Foot. On foot. The entirety of the war. So I should spend some time with the actuary tables. Mid-19th century, 47 to 51 would be the equivalent of what today, with our longer time spans.
75, 70?
Yeah.
60, 70.
60 to 70 probably, yeah.
Average age for a Civil War soldier?
The average age of a Civil War soldier from the beginning of the war to the end of the war is 18 to 25. Now, at the beginning of the war, you can find a higher percentage of younger and older men in units. Most, particularly, most younger people under 18 and most older people soon found the rigors of soldier life more than they could handle. And so if they could find a way out of the Army, guess what they did? They got out of the Army. And once the Confederates adopted conscription in the spring of 1862, you should have seen the number of 17 and 16-year-olds saying, ooh, I'm only 17 or 16, and the conscription age is 18. And the number of 36, 37, 38, 39-year-olds who said, I'm over 35, I'm out of here too. Now the Confederates will later raise the conscription age to 40 and 45 and actually lower it to 17, although 17-year-olds were not supposed to go to mainline units. But Fielder is older. On the morning of the 17th, he wrote, "The morning beautiful, health only tolerable. About 9 a.m., the regiment was called together to hear General Bragg's Order 180, the substance of which was that we had accomplished the object intended by falling back from Chattanooga, that we had driven back Rosecrans' flanking wings, had offered him fight twice, which he had refused to accept, and we being strongly reinforced would now attack him in his own place of fancied security, etc., etc. We drew and cooked one day's rations. At 3 p.m., we were called into line and marched off right in front, each company detailing one man to remain with the wagons to cook. We marched about 10 miles, which took us until about 7 o'clock. We were halted and bivouacked for the night." His recording of Bragg's general order is accurate. He may well have approached the adjutant of the regiment and said, "May I copy that or reread it again to then be able to make the entry in his diary?" But they had marched north that evening from Lafayette as the first part of Bragg implementing his plan. On the 18th, they had been positioned there along West Chickamauga Creek opposite Lee and Gordon's Mill. And Fielder recorded in his diary, Friday the 18th, "Morning pretty cool, having clouded up in the night, and there is blowing a high north wind, health tolerable. About 8 o'clock we heard attention, and were soon on line and marched off by the right flank, taking a small road running nearly due north. We soon passed some cavalry and marched about 3 miles and were halted. Several generals passed on in front of us, among them General Cheatham, Governor Harris, the then governor of Tennessee, and others. About 11 o'clock, several shots of artillery were distinctly heard to our left and front. About 12 o'clock, a pretty heavy general firing of artillery in different directions in front of us, which was kept up quite spirited, with a smart sprinkling of small arms until about 2 o'clock, when the firing measurably ceased. He's describing the action for control of the crossings over West Chickamauga Creek. We were moved forward a short distance and halted, where we remained all night. About dark, there was quite a fierce combat a short distance in front, fighting, it is said, for Chickamauga. As that was the only stream of water near, it was soon announced that we had driven the enemy beyond the stream and our pickets were on the other side. Our boys were soon down to the stream, filling their canteens and slaking their thirst from the beautiful Chickamauga. That drought of 1862-1863 had caused even the larger springs to flow at a much reduced volume. Keeping their 1-quart canteens full had become quite a chore. And once the crossing, or once the bank of the creek was secured, the men took advantage of filling their canteens in West Chickamauga Creek. Water from a creek was not as preferred as water from a spring, but if a spring is not handy and you're desperately thirsty, you're going to drink that creek water. The next morning, the morning of the 19th, they will cross West Chickamauga Creek. That morning, the man who writes the brigade report, John C. Vaughn, the colonel of the 13th Tennessee, and the commander of the 13th and 154th Consolidated, says early on the morning of the 19th, the brigade moved forward and crossed the creek and formed line of battle. And then about 11 a.m., Cheatham says, I received direct orders from the general commanding the army, Braxton Bragg, through Lieutenant Parker of his staff, to move to the extreme right of our line to support Major General Walker, whose division had been for some time warmly engaged, and who reported himself as being heavily pressed by superior numbers of the enemy, whose subsequent events disclosed had, or was at the time, concentrating the bulk of his force on our right and in front of Major General Walker's command. Preston Smith, John C. Vaughn says, we received orders to move by the right flank at double quick in support of General Walker. And on arriving at the scene of the action, we found General Walker stoutly resisted and his command much exhausted from long and continued action. We were ordered to form line immediately, formed as before on the left of General Jackson's brigade. And as soon as formed, or as Cheatham says, about 12 meridian, we were ordered to advance and engage the enemy. Colonel Rice of the 29th Tennessee says, my instructions from General Smith through Captain Harris were, in the absence of other orders, to keep aligned on the 11th Regiment to my right. Colonel Watkins of the 12th and 47th says, at noon, we began the advance, and they began moving forward. Now, this brigade is formed with the 13th Tennessee on the right, and the 154th paired with it just to its left. So the right right regiment or battalion in the brigade is the 13th and 154th, and then the consolidated 12th and 47th Tennessee, then the 11th Tennessee, and on the left of the brigade is the 29th Tennessee. Scott's Tennessee Battery, at this time under Lieutenant A.T. Watkins. Captain Scott is sick and is not with the battery at that moment. Scott's Tennessee Battery is following behind the brigade. In most of Cheatham's brigade, the standard position for the battery would be the center of the brigade when needed. But initially, the battery is following behind. But with this idea of being near the center of the brigade, we're here at the position marked for Scott's Battery on the battlefield now. And what do you see to the front of the gun monuments right here? Yeah. What should we be seeing? Field. Yep. The fact that this was Scott's eventual position is another indication of just how much larger Brockfield would have been historically. But here we are now in the sector of Preston Smith's brigade. They've come up from that direction, come here to the edge of Brockfield, and are now going to advance in that field. And we'll do that ourselves in a minute or so. Questions or observations at this time? I'll take advantage of this since we are here. Many people come to learn that the National Military Park has a large collection of Civil War cannon, and all of the cannon the National Military Park displays, all of the tubes or the barrels, all of this part is original. Now, the original wartime carriages were mostly wood with iron fittings. And on these, so when the National Military Park is created, the veterans recognized quickly that while the War Department might be able to ship the carriages as well as the tubes, the wooden carriages would not last long outside in the weather. And so the Park Commission had patterns made to cast iron display carriages. And that's what you see here. And many of the parts on these carriages are still the original from the 1890s. We've made some modifications. All of the axle bodies have been replaced to strengthen the axle. Cast iron is not real strong. It's a pretty brittle metal. And over the years, we've had a number of axles broken and the cannon collapsed. And so we've replaced all of the axle bodies with an improved one. It's actually made out of better metal. And then there's also a stainless steel rod in there to reinforce the axle itself. On these display carriages, what is painted green would have been wood, and what is painted black would have been iron. But the barrels themselves are original. And as folks learn that we have lots of cannon here, they ask, have they been here since the battle? How many of them were here at the battle? Well, there's only one that we are pretty confident was actually, of the 256 we have, that we are pretty confident were actually here at the time of the battle. It's this one right here. This 12-pound field howitzer, and if you come up and look at the markings on it, CA Ames and Company, Boston, Massachusetts, the date over here, the weight and letters on the muzzle. This matches a tube on a list of ordnance shipped from the battlefield to the Confederate arsenal in Atlanta, Georgia, at the end of September, the beginning of October of 1863. So we are very confident that it would have been here. We do not know who used it, whether it was Union or Confederate, or which battery might have used it. The Confederates, capturing 36 pieces of artillery in the battle, upgraded the guns in some of their batteries as a result of capturing better pieces. So this could have been a tube that they had acquired earlier, captured elsewhere earlier, been using, and then that battery got a better gun here and turned this one in. We just don't know for certain, but it is on that list of ordnance shipped to Atlanta. So if you want to see a cannon that almost certainly was here at the Battle of Chickamauga, this is the one. All right, it's further to the south than it does today. In fact, basically the same distance to the south that it does today. So if you measure Brockfield from Brotherton Road south across the field, and use that same distance, it would extend that much further to the south. Now as we turn westward, we would be advancing out into what was then open ground at Brockfield. However, there was a thin strip of vegetation on a little drainage up there. We'll see one arm of that here in a minute, which kind of divided the field into two segments. For the 11th Tennessee, or 11th Tennessee on the left center, and the 29th Tennessee on the left, they're moving initially out into this southern portion of the field, and they have less contact with the enemy. So what we're going to do is follow this path, and we'll come up on Preston Smith's line in Brockfield. Just a little bit, it might emphasize it a little bit, but you'll see some lighter green there, some yellowish green. That's Brockfield as it is today. There would have been just a thin line of vegetation about where the wood line is at the time, but we'd be in part of Brockfield here as well. So this gives you a little sense of how much larger Brockfield was at the time of the battle. Wooded, forested environment, while the trees were thin enough to be able to see 150 or 200 yards down through the woods in most places at the time, because the open range grazing had eaten the understory. Still, that only 150 or 200 yard visibility was limiting for a brigade commander. He couldn't see across the full length of his brigade line. Division commanders could not see more than a part of one brigade of their line. And then, when the fighting began, the overhead forest cover trapped and held the smoke in, and even that 200-yard visibility is suddenly reduced to as little as 30 or 10 or 20 yards. And so one of the things that soldiers and leaders craved more than anything else in the Battle of Chickamauga was visibility. And what did something like Brockfield offer them? Visibility. And the Federals, who are approaching from the other side of the field, they come to the edge of the field there, and they will initially advance into it. But as Preston Smith advanced, they're going to fall back, and they're going to take advantage of the woods on the other side of the field for cover and concealment, and the open ground in their front providing observation. And not only can they shelter behind the trees, but those Federals on the north side of Brock Road have what else to use for cover, concealment, and protection? The felled trees, the fallen timber of that area that was being cut. So the Federals actually are going to, their line is going to start to more conform to the edge of the woods on the other side of the field. And that's going to force Cheatham's line to begin to conform as well. And just as we have done over the last few feet, we have gone from moving westward to now turning northward. Smith's men did not, well, some of them eventually on the left end of the line, the 29th Tennessee, would indeed be going at the end essentially true northward, but they're going to be curving around to try to conform to the way the Federal line is beginning to fold back as well. And so we've now turned kind of like Preston Smith's line did. And so let's get up here where we can look into the field. Erected by the state of Tennessee to the 12th and 47th Tennessee consolidated. And notice at the angle that it kind of sits at. The Brigade line is now folding around to conform to the Federals who have taken shelter in the woods on the other side of the field. So let's step right up to the edge of the field there. The field continued further to the west as well, and over there on the left end of the Brigade line are the 29th and the 11th and 29th Tennessee, and the Colonel Rice of the 29th says, our line not being formed parallel with the enemy. The right came under fire sometime before the left. My regiment was consequently the last to get into the engagement, the brigade having made a swing on the right regiment, having double-quicked some distance over rough ground studded in some places with thick, short undergrowth. The line of the regiment was considerably broken, and some confusion prevailed at the time we halted. A volley from the enemy at that moment added still more to the confusion, but the prompt and energetic efforts of the officers soon restored comparative order. I will take the liberty here of mentioning the gallantry of Ed H. Clayton of General Smith's staff. He came to the regiment just as it got first under fire at the time of the confusion prevailed, and by his cool, daring, and persevering efforts gave me material assistance in restoring order, for which I tender him my thanks. The regiment at once commenced firing. The brigade on our left not moving up at the time we did, my left was for some time exposed to an enfilading fire from the enemy's sharpshooters, I suppose. It was in the three left companies. The loss was the heaviest, the extreme left company losing 16 men. The regiment remained in this position until several company officers reported to me their men were running short of ammunition. The fact was at once communicated to General Smith, and very soon after I received an order to fall back with the 11th Tennessee to a fence 70 or 80 yards in the rear, and I ordered the men to lie down behind the fence and distribute what ammunition was left equally among themselves and reserve it to be used in case the enemy advanced. After remaining in this position some time, another brigade passed us and moved to the front and very soon we moved back with the rest of the brigade to the road where we originally formed. That's the very left of the brigade line, and if we were to go down the trail there to the west of us, we could find the marker for the 29th Tennessee. We'd also find the marker for the 11th Tennessee. But we are here now at in the area where the 12th and 47th was engaged, and their colonel Watkins said, in this order at 12 noon we began the advance and moved forward to a position about 400 yards from the enemy, who seemed to be entrenched. They're not actually entrenched, but what are they taking advantage of? The fallen timber on the other in the woods across across the Brotherton Road there, and using it for field fortifications. Having an open field between us, except a few yards of timber next to the enemy's line. Here, the 154th and 13th Tennessee, by a wheel to its left pivot, separated from my command. And while my command and the 11th Tennessee moved straight forward, the 11th Tennessee halting in a drain by which it was to some extent protected from the enemy's fire. My regiments were moving forward to the enemy when I was ordered to fall back by Captain Donaldson of General Smith's staff, which I endeavored to do, but before my regiments were quite back to the fence, I was ordered by Captain Harris, Assistant Inspector General, to move forward. And I was moving forward, fall back, and then move forward from two brigade staff officers, different contradictory orders. And I was moving forward to the position on the prolongation of the line of the 11th when I was ordered by General Smith to fall back to the fence, which I did, and here held my regiments, protected in a measure by the low fence until General Straw's brigade passed us, and we were ordered to retire. One of the men in the 12th and 47th is Captain Fielder, and he will record in his diary of this September the 19th. Rose very early, health tolerable, clear and quite cool, a white frost. We were called into line a little before 6 o'clock and moved by the right flank and marched a short distance. The wagons coming up with our cooked rations, we were halted and drew them, placing them in our haversacks, and were soon again in motion. There appears to be a general forward movement. Our men all appear to be in high spirits and very determined. We are advancing very cautiously. Our brigade crossed the Chickamauga about 8 o'clock and filed to the right. General Cheatham superintending the crossing. After crossing, we were put in position as rapidly as possible and moved forward a short distance and halted. There was a scattering fire, both artillery and small arms, going on the morning several miles or in length, which became more frequent as the morning advanced until 10 o'clock. The fight commenced in earnest, and especially on our right, at a distance of some 2 miles, was very heavy until about 11 o'clock, when there was comparative cessation for some half hour, when it commenced very heavy again in the same direction, when our division was faced to the right and double-quicked about 1.5 miles, halted and ordered to load, and then pushed forward in line of battle. In a few minutes, we were engaged in an awful fight, the enemy disputing every inch of the ground. We fought for about 2 hours before we were relieved, without gaining any ground, when we were relieved and ordered to fall back a short distance and then lie down in line and rest. But several of our brave boys had been killed and wounded. W.M. Atkins and W.D. Bell of my company had been shot through the head and died instantly. Lieutenant D.E. Drain had been shot through the head, though not dead. D.N. Eccles had been shot through the left leg with a canister shot. W.L. Hampton had been badly shot in the shoulder. G.L. Rice through the thigh, and several others slightly wounded. The fighting continued heavy until about 4 o'clock, when it partially ceased. About sundown, a very heavy fight occurred on our right. So, in just or in that fight, the 12th and 47th will take some significant casualties here on this ground. So let's walk down Smith's line, and we'll get to the right of the brigade. Fourth Tennessee. We were ordered forward beginning about 12 o'clock, said Lieutenant Colonel Pittman, who writes the report for the regiment. The regiment's then under the command of A.J. Vaughn marched gallantly forward, engaged the enemy, driving them before us to the and drove them to their temporary breastworks, where they made a stubborn resistance. Of course, it's not actually true field fortification, but the Federals are taking advantage of the felled timber on the other side of the Brotherton Road for some cover and concealment and fighting positions. Our brave men and officers were moving rapidly forward upon them when Brigadier General Smith ordered me to withdraw the men, which was immediately done. Our brigade was then relieved by Straw's brigade after having engaged the enemy for about 2 hours and nearly exhausting our ammunition. We retired beyond the range of the small arms of the enemy. That ad hoc sharpshooter battalion that had been created just 10 days earlier, Smith attempted to deploy them across the brigade's front as the advance began, but they had only gotten 2 companies deployed before the brigade advance and contact with the enemy negated the need to deploy the skirmishers. And so Dawson will rally the men on the right of the brigade and just move forward with the brigade. And they succeeded in driving the enemy in our front some 600 yards. A part of the ground over which my command had to advance was an open space over timber recently fallen. They will move forward and participate until they too exhaust their ammunition and then fall back. Lieutenant Watson brings Scott's battery into action. We were to go just straight through the woods there. We would come to the guns where we stood earlier. And Watson said we came into action under a heavy fire of musketry by the enemy about 2 p.m. Several privates wounded in coming into action. Opened fire on the enemy with spherical case and canister at a distance of 300 to 400 yards with effect. The howitzer of the right section, after firing 2 rounds, was disabled by the cap square breaking. After firing 15 or 20 minutes, First Lieutenant John H. Morris was severely wounded by a minie-ball passing through his left arm and was taken from the field. I continued firing under a heavy fire from the enemy of musketry, shell, and canister for about 30 minutes. The men maintained their position and acted very gallantly during the action. When the brigade was ordered back, I then withdrew to the rear some half mile. The Federals that Smith's brigade are encountering are men of John Palmer's division, in particular here, Hazen's brigade in this area, the monument there to the 124th Ohio, and just beyond it the 9th Indiana, 41st Ohio monument right here. They also have the 6th Kentucky in their brigade, but they're not represented by a commemorative feature here. they had advanced out into the field, but then they're going to fall back and take advantage of the timber on the other side of the road and the trees on that side of the field. Eventually, Hazen will be relieved. Part of John Turchin's brigade will come into this area. We pass some of their markers for their role in the fighting here, but this is more action, which is going to just extend the battle line on further to the south during the course of the afternoon. And if we were to follow Cheatham's line on out to the west, we would find that swing to the right or further to the north would extend into Wright's brigade, which will then expose that left of Wright's brigade to the attack of Van Cleve, and the incident there with Carnes's battery. This action here with Cheatham's division really did nothing to achieve Bragg's desire of cutting the Union Army off from Chattanooga, and is just emblematic of this growing meeting engagement that is occurring throughout most of September the 19th. Questions or observations here? Yes, sir.
Where was Brockholm?
The Brockholm stood in kind of the, just in the woods there at that kind of point of the woods there. So. Yes.
When they play safe, this was farthest thing.
Well, probably, although only rarely do they record real specifics about why a monument is in a particular place. They mark battle lines, but whether it is the furthest point or just a point they occupied, and that is only rarely recorded. Back there where we started, where the monuments to the 15th Ohio, 49th Ohio, 32nd Indiana, 89th Illinois are, those are clearly positions that those regiments occupied in the evening, the twilight action in there, not their furthest forward point of advance. So only rarely do we get real specifics.
So did each, when they were in the 1890s, when they were doing planning, did they have one commission, or did they have each state put in and say, oh no?
Well, each state was authorized to erect markers, and almost all of the states appointed a state commission to come and decide where the markers were going to go. Now also, the Park Commission accepted visits by any veteran, and they, based on accounts, they would mark different places as related by different veterans with a stake. I have often said I would love to have seen this place in like 1893, 1894 with all of the stakes.
That would be a great backstory.
Yeah, if we had that, yep.
Yeah.
Later, when the state of Indiana, or excuse me, state of Louisiana sent their commission here to look at potentially putting up markers for Louisiana, this is a little later on, and literally in the 1890s, there are some significant advancements in photography, and so by the late 1890s, photography actually was more practical than it was in 1893, and so the state of Louisiana Commission brings a photographer with them, and they photographed scenes of the area where they were going to erect markers, and in many of those pictures, they say the white rag is draped over a stake or a stump or a shrub or something, marking the location where the marker is going to go, or marking the location where this, that, or the other thing happened. And it's clear that other commissions did something similar. But if there was extensive record keeping of where all those stakes were put, that has long disappeared, sadly. So,
So just one more follow-up.
Okay, yep.
So they left it up to the states. There was no.
well, the Park Commission had review authority,
Okay.
but by and large, the states got what they wanted. And by and large, I'd say, the states were not necessarily trying to pull a fast one on anybody. Now, some of the veterans were, and there were long fights over things, and many of the markers up on Snodgrass Hill are misplaced further to the east, so that the 35th Ohio can wind up on hill number 2. But pretty closely. Now, most recently, Robert Carter has been going through the monument files here, and so, Robert, how many times have you found where somebody records, we're putting this monument here because something particular happened? So.
It's hard to even say that, because there's some people say this happened here, and then you'll have another report where they moved the monuments because then they found out, oh, it wasn't there. And that happened a lot, like, 1900 and 1905, like vets reports, you'll see where they had to move the monuments because they found out that it wasn't there. I'm trying to think off the top of my head, because there's some that get moved on Brotherton.
Yeah, with the 105th Ohio monument is moved from the side of the Lafayette Road, and as part of kind of the compromise with that marker for them is put on Brotherton Road up here, so yeah, there were disagreements. The 9th Indiana guys fought a long, unsuccessful battle to have their monument not in Brotherton Field, but up on Snodgrass Hill.
Okay. Yeah.
They also fought with the 9th Pennsylvania, because their monuments were the same. And there was a big squabble about it. They finally won and got to have their monument, which is up there on Brotherton as well. But that was pretty interesting that they had a squabble about likeness in a monument.
When was the last squabble?
Well, let's see. Carnes is back here in the 20s and is not happy with the way that the guns at his battery position are positioned, and at some time after that, they actually change them to what he wanted. That might be the last one. That might be the last one that involved a veteran.
Yes, because then you could say as a squabble, the last squabble was
Bushrod Johnson.
Yeah, that's the 70s.
Yeah. A fellow becomes enamored with Bushrod Johnson and wants to erect a monument to Bushrod Johnson, except that monuments to individuals here are not allowed. They have to be to units and organizations. And so eventually, to get a monument with Johnson's likeness on it, a monument is constructed that the official name of it is the Bushrod Johnson Division Monument. And it does commemorate all of the units in Bushrod Johnson's provisional division. But Noble Wyatt's real purpose was to try to erect a monument to Bushrod Johnson, and so that's why it's got that half bust of Johnson on the top of it, and the footstone from his original grave in Alton, Illinois, on the back of it. So.
Didn't I read somewhere that there was a guy that went and traveled north and south and sold monuments there? There's even a Yankee monument I think in Mississippi, and a Confederate monument up north somewhere. But wrong figure on each one.
Right. Eventually, there are a number of companies that really specialize in building monuments to Civil War soldiers. The Muldoon Monument Company out of Louisville was one of the big ones, and they kind of almost assembly line process turned out generic looking Civil War figures, and you can find Muldoon monuments built entirely by Muldoon in lots of places. And they advertised in Confederate Veteran and other veterans publications. And you could also find Muldoon figures on monuments that might be made out of other stone, but they then bought the figure from Muldoon. So. All right, well, we need to work our way back to our beginning. Yes.
Imagining the original size of Blackfield, you talked about the east and the south. How far back was the original woodland?
To the west.
How far back?
Probably another 150 yards.
How about north?
North, this is the north end of it's about right, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So it needs to go further that way, and further that way down there. That wood line's about the right place because the Brock farmstead was just in the trees right over here. So.
Thank you.
All right.